Thursday, May 16, 1996 Daily Sitka Sentinel newspaper. Page 1. Headline: Suspect arrested in teen slaying.
A 34-year-old Sitka man walked into the Sitka police station early Wednesday and confessed to the May 4th murder and rape of 17-year-old Jessica Baggen. After his statement was videotaped, Richard Bingham was arrested and jailed at 5:04 p.m. Wednesday. The police department issued a news release announcing the arrest and the subsequent search of Bingham's boat at Thompson Harbor. Bingham was arraigned at 9 a.m. today, charged with murder in the first degree and sexual assault in the first degree. Bail was set at $500,000. After the arraignment, reporters asked Sitka Police Chief John Newell whether Bingham had been a suspect prior to the time he made his statement, but Newell said he would not comment on that or other details of the case. Svobodny's affidavit filed with the court to support his charges on the two unclassified felonies states: 1. I am the district attorney for Sitka. 2. I have spoken with the investigators of the Sitka Police Department, including Officer David Tugman and Lieutenant Nick Ward, and have reviewed the video recording of Richard Bingham's statement on May 15, 1996. 3. The officers indicated to me that they are investigating the death of Jessica Baggen. 4. On May 4, 1996, it was reported that Jessica Baggen had not returned home after leaving her sister's residence. 5. A search was conducted, and on the morning of May 6, 1996, her body was found in a shallow grave near Totem Park. 6. Upon the body being autopsied at the Alaska State Crime Laboratory, the pathologist reported that she had died from asphyxiation and had been raped. 7. On May 15, 1996, Richard Bingham stated that he met Jessica on the bike path near Totem Park, wrapped his arm around her neck, choking her. He described having sexual intercourse with her and burying her body. At the time of his arrest, Bingham, who acquaintances said has lived in Sitka about 25 years, was employed by Sheldon Jackson College as a custodian. SJC President Ken Cameron said Bingham had daytime duties at the college and did not live on campus.
Wow, no one saw this coming. May 15th, 3 days after the town meeting of Fears Questions on Murder addressed, where Police Chief Newell stated they have no suspects. We are told that Richard Bingham walks into police station and confesses to the rape and murder of Jessica Baggen. On May 23rd, 8 days after arrest, Richard Bingham is indicted by a grand jury. One would believe that an indictment that occurred this quick, that the confession must be solid, and there must have been eyewitnesses. If there was any physical evidence other than a fingerprint, testing would likely not have been completed at this time. What is interesting, Richard Bingham pleaded not guilty. What would have made Bingham first confess, and then 8 days later pleads not guilty? The court date for Mr. Bingham kept getting pushed out. There were only a few articles that I found that discussed the trial before it began in June of 1997. The information we did get was not from the police, but newspaper articles about the defense attorney Galen Payne's court filings.
Tuesday, January 28, 1997. Daily Sitka Sentinel. Page 1. Headline: Trial date moved to June in Sitka slaying.
Superior Court Judge Larry Weeks on Monday moved back the date for the murder trial of Richard Bingham to June 2. The trial had been set originally for March 3, but on December 24, Public Defender Galen Payne filed for a postponement on the grounds that the defense needed more time to evaluate the state's tests of physical evidence. She said the defense also may need time to complete its own tests. In Payne's December 24 request for a later trial date, she wrote,
"This case is peculiar in that the state has, at this moment, only Mr. Bingham's confession to link him to the scene of the murder. No physical evidence puts Mr. Bingham at the scene, and in fact the tests done so far on the physical evidence points to another person. No hair, fibre, fluids or blood on the scene match Mr. Bingham. It matches either the victim or an unknown person."
Thursday, February 27, 1997. Daily Sitka Sentinel. Page 1. Headline: Defense files motions in Sitka murder case.
Public Defender Galen Payne filed a flurry of motions this month in the pre-trial defense of Richard Bingham, accused in the rape and murder of Jessica Baggen last May 4. In motions to the court filed between February 10th and the 25th, Payne argued for
1. Suppression of part of Bingham's videotaped confession because he was improperly influenced by police to incriminate himself. 2. Suppression of any statements Bingham made to police after he asked for an attorney. 3. Dismissal of the indictments because the grand jury did not hear evidence favorable to Bingham. 4. Transfer the trial to another community because of pretrial publicity.
In her February 20th brief to the court, Payne argued that Sitka police used interrogation methods which tend to produce untrue statements.
Mr. Bingham was induced to confess falsely through the use of extrinsic means. Payne said the investigators invoked God, the afterlife, the victim's family, and the community, and promised him help as inducements for him to self-incriminating statements. Case law and research shows that this type of coercion tends to produce untruthful confessions. The statements made by the suspect following appeals based on police references to God, the afterlife, the family, and the community should be suppressed.
From these two articles, we start to see the defense's strategy. A confession that was coerced. I thought it was odd that the physical evidence excluded Richard Bingham and pointed to an unknown male. And the state of Alaska still proceeded with the trial, meaning that if the state was unable to identify the contributor of the bloodstain on Jessica's clothing, this in itself could lead to reasonable doubt. Richard Bingham's confession must have been convincing. Otherwise, the state will need additional circumstantial evidence and eyewitnesses.
Monday, June 9, 1997. Daily Sitka Sentinel newspaper. Page 1. Headline: Jury selection starts in Sitka murder case.
Jury selection in the murder trial of Richard Ray Bingham began this morning in Juneau, but the process was slower than Superior Court Judge Larry Weeks had anticipated. Weeks said before the trial began that he hoped the jury could be seated in time for opening arguments to be heard this afternoon. Each of the potential jurors answered basic questions from the judge, such as occupation and whether they anyone involved in the case. He allowed the prosecutor and public defender 1 hour apiece to ask their own questions. McConnell, the prosecutor asked,
Have any of you previously heard anything about this case?
Most jurors said they had.
Have any of you ever blacked out from drinking?
No one said they had.
Are any one of you familiar with the flashback effect that some people experience after a traumatic event?
At that question, the judge called the attorneys to the bench for a conference and the proceedings were briefly recessed. After the recess, McConnell asked potential jurors,
Have any one of you watched TV programs such as 20/20ths or police dramas like NYPD Blues? Are any of you involved in the healthcare profession? Do any of you know anyone who was a psychiatrist or psychologist? Are you able to deal with difficult subject matters and possibly disturbing photographs?
Defense attorney Galen Payne questioning was more focused. She asked them 2 main questions.
Do you believe that someone can black out from consuming too much alcohol? Do you believe that someone can be persuaded to do something that they would not otherwise do or admit to something they had not done?
Most said they had heard of alcohol-induced blackouts or knew someone who had suffered one. To varying degrees, they all said they believe it is possible that people, particularly children, can be influenced to admit to something they didn't do.
Tuesday, June 10, 1997. Daily Sitka Sentinel newspaper. Page 1. Headline: Bingham's attorney says evidence faulty.
The Richard Bingham murder trial began in earnest this morning with the prosecution arguing that his confession matches many of the facts of the case, and the defense asserting that physical evidence points to elsewhere and that Bingham has an alibi. Assistant District Attorney Dwayne McConnell, the prosecutor for the state, gave an opening statement recounting how Bingham walked into the Sitka Police Department on May 15, 1996, 5:30 a.m. and said,
I've got to get this off my chest. I am having flashbacks, in which I see myself burying something in Indian River. then washing my hands in the river. I am here to sort things out. Bit by bit, Bingham remembers things.
The prosecutor said Bingham told police.
I remembered meeting somebody near the flume. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the victim's hairband, called a scrunchie, was found off the bike path between the flume and Indian River. The scrunchie was discovered in a grassy area, and Baggen's jeans were found to have grass stains. Eventually, Bingham told the officers that he remembered talking to Jessica. She was heading home, and he wrapped his arms around her throat. Also, Richard Bingham remembers seeing Jessica walking across the campus of Sheldon Jackson College in a black dress on May 2nd, just 2 days before the murder. Several aspects of the confession, including the method of death, the fact that she screamed, that Baggen did not put up much of a defense, and that her face was driven hard into dirt, are supported by the evidence. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I will admit that the physical evidence isn't perfect. The evidence will show that we have some unanswered questions in this case.
In her opening statement, Bingham's attorney, public defender, Galen Payne, said,
There are definitely plenty of unanswered questions. The evidence will show very clearly he didn't do this deed. Their paths never crossed that night. Mr. Bingham has an alibi. He was drinking on a small boat with other people during the time period in which Baggen was killed. He confessed, partly because of who he is and because of the technique used by police. Mr. Bingham was paranoid and became caught up in the hysteria surrounding the murder. More than a week had passed between the time Baggen's body was found and the time of Mr. Bingham's alleged confession. During that period, a friend jokingly told Mr. Bingham that Bingham had killed the girl when he was blacked out from drinking. The police then helped convince him that he committed the crime by invoking religion and suggesting that his anxiety attacks were a message from gods. This is when Mr. Bingham started agreeing with the officers and filling in what they wanted to hear. The police didn't listen when Mr. Bingham gave information that conflicted with the facts of the murder. There was no information in Mr. Bingham's statement that he could not have heard on the street. As for the physical evidence, there is nothing in it that points to Mr. Bingham as the rapist and killer. You will hear from the State Crime Lab that there's not a single trace of Mr. Bingham at the crime scene. Perhaps the most telling physical evidence is 5 pubic hairs at the scene, which does not come from Mr. Bingham or Jessica Baggen.
Thursday, June 12, 1997. Daily Sitka Sentinel newspaper. Page 1. Headline: Clues don't link Bingham to crime.
Jurors in the murder and sexual assault trial of Richard Bingham were shown a videotape Wednesday in which the defendant demonstrated how he choked Jessica Baggen to death and hid her body. The jury also heard from the crime lab specialists testifying on the physical evidence at the scene, which failed to link Bingham to the sexual assault or the murder for which he is being tried. A state criminalist said 5 pubic hairs at the scene were not from Bingham or the victim, but did appear to have come from a single individual who has not been identified. The videotape showed part of the interview officers conducted with Bingham after he appeared at the police station nearly 2 weeks after Baggen's death, saying was haunted by flashbacks that might be related to the case. The video showed a despondent Bingham staring the floor as he listened to Sitka Police Lieutenant Nick Ward exhorting him to overcome any alcohol-induced blackout and remember details of Baggen's murder. Lieutenant Nick Ward and Richard Bingham on video.
Richard, the family wants some closure on this. And I think you need some closure too. You have to do the right thing.
Bingham didn't volunteer any information at first, saying only that he didn't remember. But eventually he began responding to Ward's questions. On the videotape at one point, you can hear Mr. Bingham mumbling,
Yes, I guess I did it. But I want the blood tests to verify it.
But the tape had him also saying something about red clay at the site and about the sweat clothes the victim was wearing. The police knew these details did not fit the facts of the case. The tape showed that when something Bingham said was inconsistent with the known facts. Ward told him,
Let's not get hung up on that. Let's talk about something else.
Just before watching the videotape Wednesday afternoon, the jury had heard testimony from the state crime lab analyst who conducted DNA tests on some of the evidence. That analyst, Leanne Strickland, reported,
The tests of semen found on Baggen's panties at the crime scene excluded Mr. Bingham as the source, and included to a near certainty an ex-boyfriend of Miss Baggen.
The ex-boyfriend Travis testified today that he had sexual intercourse with Baggen on Thursday, the day before the 17th birthday celebration that ended with her visit to her sister's home until 1:30 a.m. Saturday. Public Defender Payne asked Strickland about the testing of the bloodstain found on Ms. Baggen's blouse.
Jessica Baggen is excluded, and Richard Bingham is also excluded as the possible source of this blood stain. A blood stain on her bra is Miss Baggen's own blood, and is not Mr. Bingham's. The blood stain found on one of Mr. Bingham's t-shirt appeared to be of his own blood, and that it was definitely not from Miss Baggen. As for the 5 reddish-blonde pubic hairs found at the scene, there were no conclusive results from DNA testing. Those pubic hairs were also the subject of testimony today by Janice Fair, a criminalist at the state crime lab. Those hairs were dissimilar to Richard Bingham's. I excluded him as a source of the hairs. In addition, the pubic hairs were not those of Ray, the ex-boyfriend. They appeared to be Caucasian, and appeared to be consistent with one source. More likely than not, they came from one source.
None of the hair or fibers at the scene point to Mr. Bingham, and Mr. Bingham's clothes contained no trace of Ms. Baggen's hair. A full duffel bag of Mr. Bingham's clothes was tested.
Friday, June 13, 1997 Daily Sitka Sentinel newspaper. Page 1. Headline: Jury in Bingham trial hears autopsy details.
The state rested its case against Richard Bingham this morning after a pathologist testified Wednesday that the autopsy of Jessica Baggen revealed injuries consistent with some of Bingham's admission to the police. The defense then started its case, call its first witnesses, and attempting to establish Bingham's alibi. Public Defender Galen Payne also stressed the lack of any scientific evidence linking Mr. Bingham to the rape and murder. Shortly after Payne began to present the case for the defense, the trial was recessed until next Wednesday morning. The prosecution's last witness, forensic pathologist Norman Thompson, showed the just gruesome photos of the victim's body and related the results of the autopsy he performed. Thompson testified,
Miss Baggen died of asphyxiation. Dirt had been stuffed forcefully into her mouth, and she had been subjected to anal and vaginal penetration. She had black eyes from being struck with a blunt object, and her body had scratches that indicated she had been dragged along the ground. There were no defensive injuries of the kind that are found on victims who attempt to fight back or defend themselves.
Several of the findings matched details in the statement Bingham made after he walked into the Sitka Police Department nearly 2 weeks after Ms. Baggen died and asked officers to help sort out his troubling flashbacks. After hours of professed memory failure and prodding by officers in that May 15, 1996 session with Sitka Police, Mr. Bingham began making incriminating admissions. One was that he choked Baggen to death from behind with his forearm. Mr. Thompson continued,
Miss Baggen died of asphyxiation, a denial of oxygen to the brain. Miss Baggen's bones in her throat were crushed, but I could not determine exactly how those injuries had occurred. It is possible that she choked to death, or the asphyxiation was caused by the dirt in the victim's mouth. Miss Baggen's mouth was so completely full of dirt that her tongue was pushed up and back, blocking her air passage. The dirt was placed in there or pushed in there with some force. There was no way she could have breathed through her mouth.
Mr. Bingham told police he pushed her face in the dirt, but didn't say anything about stuffing dirt into Ms. Baggen's mouth. The defense also today called a fingerprint expert with the state crime lab, Michael Getz. Getz testified that Mr. Bingham's fingerprints couldn't be found on any evidence in the case, although on cross-examination by the prosecution he said the state crime lab finds prints on only 10% of the items it examines. So the absence of prints does not necessarily mean Mr. Bingham wasn't at the crime scene. Getz said that there was a fingerprint that doesn't match either Ms. Baggen or Mr. Bingham on an empty pack of Marlboro Lights, Ms. Baggen's brand found near the scene. The final witness today was Sitka Police Det. Dave Tugman, who had previously testified in the prosecution's case. Called by the defense today, Detective Tugman testified. The police had never considered Jessica's ex-boyfriend, Ray, a serious suspect and did not check his alibi. Crime lab tests showed the semen stains on Baggen's underpants came from Ray, an ex-boyfriend of the victim, who testified that he had sex with Baggen on the Thursday before the murder.
Friday, June 20th, 1997. Daily Sitka Sentinel newspaper. Page 1. Headline: Bingham acquitted.
After deliberating about 2 hours, the jury in the Richard Bingham murder and sexual assault trial found the defendant innocent on all counts. The verdict came shortly after 3 p.m. today. Closing arguments in the 2-week trial had concluded at 1 p.m. and the jury had lunch before starting to deliberate. Public defender Galen Payne contended. Throughout the trial, it was a false confession, the result of the psychological pressure on a suspect who was mentally confused and paranoid. Mr. Bingham had gone to the police station voluntarily, seeking help to deal with disturbing flashbacks. Both the prosecution and defense agreed that Mr. Bingham was intoxicated the night Ms. Baggen was murdered, but other than that, their theories of the case differed widely. "I am surprised the jury took only 2 hours," said Vicky Baggen, mother of the murder victim, after the verdict. She and other family members attended every day of the trial. "We the family still feel he is guilty," said Ms. Baggen, her lip trembling with emotion. "We certainly don't fault anybody who worked on the case. They worked hard on the case. They did the best they could do with what they had." The jurors left the courtroom by a rear door leading to the jury room a floor above. As they were preparing to go their separate ways, a reporter caught up with 3 jurors and asked about the deliberations. The group's unanimous decision, said one, was very clear. "I think given the guidelines we were given." The 2 others nodded in assent, but did not comment. After the jury retired to deliberate, Judge Weeks complimented both attorneys in the trial. He told McConnell that he'd done his usual outstanding job as prosecutor, and commented that Payne had made the most competent attack on a confession that he has seen in 25 years as a lawyer and judge.